Context: Haiti, the Haiti earthquake. Now, if there was some evil spirit lurking around and decided that we were really going to have an occasion for calamity on earth, Haiti would have been a natural place for that calamity. Why? He was one of the poorest countries in the world. The population had very little reason to have any respect for government because government had never served their interests very well, depending upon what part of the population. If you were very wealthy, government served your interest, but absent that, it didn't. The police were notoriously corrupt, so there was really no point in going to judicial authority for correction of any injustice. It just wasn't going to happen. People were living as close to marginal existence as possible because of the total breakdown in transportation, the total breakdown in the education system. Communication in many parts of the country was virtually non-existent. So then you have an earthquake. And whatever government represented, and whatever the UN presence, and there was a UN presence, something like 40 to 70% of that presence disappeared automatically because they were either killed or totally out of context in communication. All right, from an organizational point of view, and let me remind you that you represent various constituencies, donor, NGOs, military, and so forth. How do you deal with decision-making in the event of these disasters? Let me present a perspective. You all arrived here within the last day or so, I assume. Is that reasonable? What was the first thing you thought about when you arrived here? Accommodation. Along with accommodation, you also thought about communication. How am I going to let my friends know I arrived safely? Then you thought about making sure that you had transportation. How am I going to get to the university and back to my lodging, wherever that is? On the ground, the first day, everything you've said in terms of reaching out to communities is essentially what you have to do. But the first thing you would think about doing is giving your team a base of operation which is secure, predictable, and accessible to the extent possible. Your decision-making begins on parallel planes. It begins in terms of your program engagement, but it also begins in terms of keeping your team intact and making you useful. You don't want to become a dependent upon something else. In the beginning of this discussion, we were talking about our roles, not how we were talking about enabling ourselves to carry out our roles. And you're quite right. The ideal team would have someone, from the moment you cross that border, that person would, I've got to find a place where people can sleep tonight. I've got to make sure that place is secure and that they have clean drinking water, because remember, we've just had an earthquake. The humanitarian enterprise does not function in a rational way. It functions on the basis of, largely on the basis of impulse and motivation and desire to do good. And certainly at that level, there are some organizations that send people into the field without a team leader, and they just floundered around. Now, one can say easily that this was a terrible thing to do, but then remember the humanitarian imperative. How do we reconcile the desire to help someone with the practical modalities as to how to do it? That takes discipline and thought and organization, and we'll get to the level of emergency teams and so forth.